Today what we're going to do is we're going to begin our new series today on the life of Jesus, and we're going to be looking at the real Jesus. And when we're starting to take a look at Jesus' life and in search of what would be what is the real Jesus, the idea behind all of this series is that I've been kind of thinking, well, you know, we've got different portrayals of Jesus Christ. You know, if you go to the theater, you've got the theater's portrayal of Jesus. You turn on TV, History Channel, you got that portrayal of Jesus. You pick up different books, and it seems like today a lot of times there is this almost kind of a conspiracy theorist idea out there about who is the real Jesus. What was he really like? What was he really about? But the approach that this series is going to take is just simply to say, okay, what does the Bible have to say about Jesus? And in looking at the Bible's portrayal about Jesus, then that's what the real Jesus is going to be. And so if we're going to do that, then the very first place to start out with, at least in my mind, would be just simply, well, okay, if we're going to look at the Bible and see the Bible's portrayal of Jesus and say that is the real Jesus, then how do we know that what the Bible has to say about Jesus is right? How do we know that that is something that's accurate? How do we know that that is something that we can believe in and that we can trust in? What makes us think that the Bible would be so superior over archaeological research, or the Bible would be superior over some sort of ancient references to Jesus? Or what makes us think that the Bible will be superior to just simply what somebody else says? You know, what makes the Bible so believable? Well, one thing that I oftentimes think of is in the life of Jesus, there are really only the Gospels that give us the direct witness of Jesus Christ. You're not going to be able to go and, go to the library and pull out a historical book that was written where somebody, way long time ago in the ancient land of Palestine, knew Jesus, was acquainted with Jesus, and wrote some sort of history down about him. You're not going to be able to go to the history books and view different written records about Jesus Christ and Jesus' life from a first-person witness point of view or even second-person witness point of view. Instead, what you're going to find is you're going to find these books in the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that those are the only direct witnesses that we have of Jesus Christ. Now, that's not to say that's the only witness of Jesus Christ. We have other things as well. But I believe that God intended for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those four books, to be the only direct witnesses of His Son. And the reason why I believe that that was the only means that God chose is because that's what He wants us to pay attention to. Now, if you think about the life of Christ, there were other people that came in contact with Jesus, weren't there, other than His disciples. And there were other people that, when they came in contact with Jesus, they wrote these things down or they spoke about these things. But the only things that we have that are still with us today are these four books. And so the question is just simply this: are these four books dependable? Are these four books something that we can believe in and trust? And really, that is what's going to be the main crux of the message today. And just simply God's witness. Okay? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So before we start to go and take a look at all of the different things and start to take a look at different scriptures, first of all, who were these men that wrote these different Gospels? Who were Matthew? Who were Mark, Luke, John? Well, starting out with, and in kind of picking a different order than what we see in the New Testament, let me tell you a few things about these men. First of all, we got this man Matthew. Who was Matthew? Well, Matthew was one of the 12. He was one of the original disciples that Jesus personally selected that would follow Him around Galilee in Judea. And then after Jesus' death and resurrection, he was to be one of the 12 apostles that would go on and continue God's work. Now, by being such, Matthew was a Jew. He was somebody who had grown up in Judaism, grown up in the region of Galilee. But Matthew was a little bit different than what we might think of, because Matthew was kind of on the outskirts of society, if you will. His profession was a tax collector. Now, I know how much we like tax collectors today, right? You love the IRS. I bet you have a bumper sticker on your car that says, "I heart the IRS." Right? Anybody got that? Olga, do you have that? You don't have that? Okay. Well, I don't have that either, but I don't have any bumper stickers on my car. You know, the IRS, tax collectors, we don't really think very kindly of tax collectors today. But what if the person that was collecting the taxes was collecting the taxes for a government that was occupying the United States, and a government that we thoroughly and hated and detested? A government that was very different from our cultures, very different from our ways. You know, we say the United States is a Christian nation, which I think anymore we're kind of getting away from that very, very quickly. But let's say that this government is not a Christian nation. Let's say that this government is, is a Muslim theocracy, Islamic theocracy. How much would we like it if one of our own citizens were collecting taxes for such a regime? Would you kind of question their patriotism? Would you kind of question their Christianity? Would you kind of question their morality and everything? Yeah. Okay, now you got to picture Matthew, all right? Because that's who Matthew was. Tax collectors were people who were collecting taxes for the Roman government. Now, Matthew wasn't the big kind of tax collector. He was a small kind of tax collector. He was sitting in a toll booth, and when people would pass by, he'd say, "You got to pay me a tax to walk on the road. You got to pay me a tax to walk on the road." And so you can see that people did not like Matthew. So much so that oftentimes when you read through the Gospels, you'll see tax collectors and sinners. In other words, they were lumping tax collectors in with what they viewed as the sinners of the society that are just totally outcasts. Okay? Now, this was the man that Jesus came up to him and said, "Come, follow me." Interesting, isn't it? This is the man that God inspired to write this account of Jesus' life. So that's who Matthew is. What about Mark? Who is Mark? Well, oftentimes we kind of think that, oh, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all these people were Jesus' disciples and knew him and walked with him. Guess what? Mark didn't. Mark was not one of the 12 that was chosen. Neither was Luke, as a matter of fact. Now, there is a chance that Mark may have met Jesus or saw Jesus. There was a chance that maybe Mark, in his youth, kind of had a glimpse of Jesus. But as far as having a personal connection with Jesus, no, he did not. He was a man whose mother was an early follower of Jesus and whose mother was acquainted with people who knew Jesus. He was a man who evidently had some sort of personal connection with Peter. And a lot of times people kind of equate that Mark looked at what Peter's life was like, and Mark took a lot of Peter's teachings about Jesus and incorporated that into his gospel. But you know what? We really don't have a whole lot of evidence about that. I mean, you know, there's some things that kind of point to that way, but this is who Mark is. Now, what about Luke? Who was Luke? Well, again, Luke did not follow after Jesus as far as to physically follow. He didn't know Jesus. As a matter of fact, Luke is probably one of the very few Gentile writers of the entire Bible. He wasn't even a Jew. He was a man who was a physician. He was a man who was a Gentile. And he was a man who became acquainted with Christianity and was saved later on in life, later on down the historical road. He was a man that probably became a Christian in Paul's second missionary journey, which was some 20 years after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And so if you think about that, you say, okay, well, you know, what did Luke have to do with writing the Bible? All right, now we come down to John. John, on the other hand, was one of the very original followers of Jesus Christ. As a matter of fact, he was one of the very first people that Jesus came up to and said, "Come, follow me." He, his brother James, and then his cousins, Peter and Andrew, were one of, I guess if you could say, if Jesus had a quote-unquote inner circle, that John was in there, you know. John was there present in all kinds of different situations. As a matter of fact, when Jesus went up to the Mount of Transfiguration and he was transformed before into his glorified bodies, John was one of 3 disciples that saw it. John was somebody that when Jesus was at the Last Supper, leaned back up against Jesus' chest and said, "Lord, who's it that's going to betray you?" Okay? John is the one who, in his gospel, describes himself as the one whom Jesus loved. In other words, Jesus and John had a personal connection there. So if you think about this, these 4 men had things in common with one another because they were all Christians. They were all saved. They're all followers of Jesus. They're all godly men. But at the same time, as far as 4 men go, these guys had a very diverse background, don't you see? You have somebody who was young and maybe was a second-generation Christian, if you will. You had somebody who wasn't even a Jew and was never even part of Palestine. You had somebody who was very close to Jesus, both time-wise and as far as a physical. And you have somebody who followed Jesus, was a disciple of Jesus, was an important figure of Jesus, but at the same time, his past life was one that people didn't consider very much. Do you see the diversity that's there?